Welcome back to Spook Break, and gather around my pumpkin, we are telling ghost stories today and other spooky folktales from all over the world. And I would love to hear some of the traditional scary stories from your country, so do leave us a comment below. I'm going to put my pumpkin down now so I can show you my first book. In Irish storytelling, ghost stories have a really long tradition. So I've got here a collection of Irish ghost stories. A lot of them are tied into traditional Irish folk stories and superstitions. So for example, you can read in here the story The Child That Went With the Fairies by Sheridan Le Fanu, which is inspired by the classic Stolen Child changeling story. You also may have heard of the festival St. Martin's Eve, also known as Old Halloween. It's celebrated around the world, but in Ireland, the tradition is to sacrifice an animal and sprinkle its blood in the corners of your house. Gross. But in here, you can read a short story called St. Martin's Eve that's all about the violent and terrifying repercussions for a woman who doesn't do this. A lot of the superstitions are tied up with religion, and the scary supernatural bits are portrayed as being the work of the devil. So one more story from here that absolutely terrified me is The Haunted Organist of Hurly Burly by Rosa Mulholland. This story is about a couple whose son died many years earlier after he'd become involved in a devil's club and started playing all sorts of unholy pranks, until he'd become cursed to play an organ on repeat until he literally died playing the organ. 20 years later, the couple still can't get the organ to stop playing at night, and now a young girl shows up at their house claiming that their son sent her, and it just gets scarier and scarier from there. So that's quite enough of Ireland, let's move on. Our next stop is Japan. An interesting fact, in Japan, ghost stories are traditionally told in the summer rather than cold, spooky evenings like we're doing now, but we're going with it. Hanako-san is a Japanese legend about the ghost of a schoolgirl who haunts school bathrooms. And rumour has it that if you go to the bathrooms on the 3rd floor and knock 3 times on the 3rd stall and ask if Hanako-san is present, her hand will appear and pull you into the loo. So you can read more about Hanako-san in Hanako and the Terror of Allegory by Sakai Asuno. She appears in there as the roommate and best friend of the private detective main character who specifically investigates urban legends. The book Ponti by Charlene Teo is inspired by the Pontianak, who is allegedly the ghost of a woman who died in childbirth giving birth to a stillborn child. So not the cheeriest story there, although some versions of the legend say that the ghost is the stillborn child. In the book Ponti, we meet a woman called Amisa, who was the star of a 70s cult horror trilogy about the Pontianak. Years later, her daughter's only friend Cersei is now working on a remake of this film. And so we jump back and forth between these timelines and characters, and the theme of motherhood is particularly jarring when paired with this legend, which is all about a woman who died in childbirth. Latin American legend tells of La Llorona, a ghost who roams near water searching for her drowned children, which would be very sad except for the fact she drowned them herself. And this story does seem to actually predate its use in Latin American mythology. Similar stories are found all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Aztecs, as well as throughout Iberian and indigenous American mythology. But the first published reference to La Llorona specifically was by a Mexican poet. And this story is now apparently told to children to scare them away from going out alone at night, and you will find so many books and movies about La Llorona. But if you do want something a little bit different, I have a suggestion. If you don't want to read a horror story, Shakira Diaz's memoir Ordinary Girls has the legend of La Llorona woven throughout it, along with other stories, both true and fictional, of mothers. So that's a really interesting perspective on spooky stories, giving some context on where they come from and what they symbolize to our lives now. Now the next story isn't too spooky, but it is interesting. If you've ever wondered where California got its name from, it was named after Calafia, a warrior queen from Spanish mythology, who was the Queen of California, which was depicted as an island populated entirely by terrifying but beautiful black women who kept griffins as pets, which they trained to attack and kill any man in sight. So if you want to read up on that myth, it seems to have come from a 16th century novel, The Labours of the Very Bright Knight Esplandian. So I always think of California as a really sunny, bright, chilled place, but perhaps if you were a 16th century man, you wouldn't feel so chilled about it. Next, for a fairy tale, let's look at the Russian story of Morozco, or Father Frost. Fairy tales are always super spooky, I think, even when they're supposed to be nice children's stories. So the story of Morozco begins with an evil stepmother making her husband take his daughter into the woods and leave her there because she says they can't afford both daughters and she wants to keep her own. So the girl is abandoned in the woods and Morozco comes along to freeze her to death. That's what he does. But he's so impressed by her stoicism when he asks her if she's cold and she says, "I'm perfectly warm, thank you very much," that he takes pity on her and gives her a nice warm coat and for some reason also lots of gold and jewels. So the next day the father goes to sadly collect the body of his daughter and is thrilled to find her alive and well and now rich. So now the stepmother thinks they can get even richer. This time she sends her own daughter. But her own very rude daughter, when Morozco appears and asks if she's cold, answers with, "Of course I'm cold, you stupid old man," which Morozco does not like, and so he freezes her to death. So Morozco is a pretty scary dude, and you can find inspiration for this figure in the book Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, which is actually an adaptation of lots of different Slavic folklore. It's mostly a Rumpelstiltskin-inspired story. Next, I've got a book here, King Rat by China Mieville, which combines lots of different folklore from all over the world. It's mostly inspired by the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, which is a story that always gave me the creeps. It's about a rat catcher that lures all of the children of a village away into a cave and they're never seen again. But the book also features Anansi, a trickster spider from West African folklore, who isn't actually supposed to be spooky, but come on, spiders, terrifying. And these both combine in this book. So you have rats and spiders everywhere. In one scene, they are all put into a trance and controlled by the Piper. Yikes. Caribbean mythology includes stories of the Sucreant, or hag, who is a shapeshifter, who by day takes the form of a reclusive old woman, but by night sheds her skin and turns into a sort of vampire fireball who can get into anyone's house through any tiny little cracks and suck their blood. And the Sucreant appears in the book White is for Witching by Helen Oyeyemi, which is a really unique haunted house story about a house who is obsessively protective of the women in this family and aggressive to outsiders, particularly to people of colour. It's a racist haunted house, and it sort of turns one of the girls in the story into a Sucreant. Recent Tanzanian folklore tells of the Popobawa, a shape-shifting bat that attacks at night, and this story, which only originated in around the 60s, has caused real-life mass panics across Zanzibar, with people trying to stay awake outside their houses all night, staying together in groups for safety. And you can read more about the Popobawa in one of the stories in Mambaguma Dien's story collection Dark Moons Rising on a Starless Night, which contains so many stories inspired by African folklore, so there's so much more to learn in there. But the story called Popobawa is about this particular terrifying monster. In Chinese mythology, a jiangshi is a type of zombie, made extra terrifying by the fact it's a hopping zombie, and you can find this figure by other names in Thai, Vietnamese, Indonesian, Malay, and Korean stories as well. There's actually a whole huge genre of jiangshi movies and books and video games, but if you wanted to, you could go all the way back and read What the Master Would Not Discuss, which is this huge collection of supernatural stories compiled in the 18th century, and jiangshi feature in quite a lot of them. Ayara from Brazilian mythology is a mermaid, but nothing like our European story of the lovesick Little Mermaid. Ayara was an Amazon warrior whose brothers were jealous of her, and so they tried to kill her in her sleep, but she escaped and killed them both. Her father was furious and so threw her into the sea to drown her, but she was saved by transforming into a mermaid. Now, any man who sees her is so overcome by her beauty that he goes insane, and according to some versions of the story, she actually captures and eats them as well. You can meet Ayara in the Brazilian magical realism novel Macunaíma, which is about a shapeshifter born in the jungle, and is a blending of lots of folklore taken from native Brazilian stories, so you'll meet loads of mythological figures, including Ayara. And finally, let me tell you about the Wendigo, which is a creature from First Nations mythology. The Wendigo is allegedly a malevolent spirit that can possess humans and make them do terrible things, like murder and even cannibalism. And the Wendigo looks like a terrifying, huge skeleton. Anytime it has a meal, it grows by that amount, so it's never full. It's massive, but always emaciated and skeletal because it's still starving. And you now will find Wendigos in lots of non-Indigenous stories, for example even in Marvel comics, but a lot of the representations of the Wendigo have become very simplified and inaccurate compared to the traditional stories. So if you want to go back to the source, you should read Ojibwe Tales by Basil Johnston, who's an Ojibwe author, and the book is a collection of traditional folk tales, including that of the Wendigo. So which of those stories scared you the most? Leave us a comment below to let us know. And if you've got a spooky folktale of your own to tell, please do write that below as well. I will leave a playlist here with all of our other videos about crime, thriller and horror books while you're in the spooky mood. And see you soon!